Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to podcast EUEA Dialogues. My name is Olena Rybak. I'm the Vice Chair of the Board of the European Ukrainian Energy Agency. Our topic for today's podcast is green mortgage and everything we may need to know about buildings sustainability. This is our first podcast in 2025 after a little bit of a break, and I'm very pleased to welcome our first guest of the year, so to say, Mr. Jeff Colley. Jeff is the editor and publisher of Passive House Plus Green Building magazine. He's also the chair of Heat Pump Association of Ireland. He's a TEDx talker and a podcaster himself. And last but not least, probably there is a long list of things that I could tell about you, Jeff, but we can touch that as we go. Last but not least, Jeff is also a communicators lead for EU financed project, Smarter Finance for EU. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks very much, Olena. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining. And I propose then we touch base on and start, let's say, our conversation today with something that is on the air more and more lately, specifically through your engagement with the Smarter Finance for EU program, a rather new concept for Ukraine. I was wondering whether you would be able to tell us a little bit more about this mysterious green mortgage. What is it? What do we do with it? And how is it working in Ireland? How can we use it in Ukraine?
Okay, yeah. So I suppose we need a bunch of different kinds of green finance products to facilitate the decarbonization of buildings and the transition to kind of modern, future-proofed, secure, healthy, comfortable, low-energy building stock. Carbon is part of the equation, and it's the part that probably gets most attention because, we have a climate emergency and we have an urgent and kind of increasingly desperate need to respond to that. What we mean by green mortgages, well, it's a funny thing actually, because there's a term, I think it's abused quite routinely, because the concept of green in the context, for instance, of buildings of greenness is also abused. These terms are used quite loosely a lot of the time, without necessarily much in the way of meaning, and that could be by people who don't have any particular, just haven't done enough homework on it, or have something to sell, for instance. There could be a bunch of reasons for it, and consequently, the public gets confused. So we need finance to unlock the kind of homes that we need to build. That's true, and mortgages are an essential part of that. But we need the finance sector to really understand the need to connect specifically to credible, robust, sort of science-based approaches to ensure that the approaches we try to take to make buildings better and greener and so on actually work, right? And that can mean a bunch of things. When we think about being green, a lot of the way that this is framed, certainly in Ireland and the United Kingdom, and I can't speak for Ukraine, for instance, but a lot of the way this stuff is framed in the public discourse and media discourse and so on is about sacrifice, about doing without, about not driving, about not eating meat, about not taking holidays, not flying to take holidays or whatever it might be, or about not using so much energy in that way. Or you can leave in the imperfection. I do not mind at all. You can explain that we're working impromptu with my phone because of my one-man battle against my own limitations and against technology. I've a computer that's not behaving itself this morning. So the point is that so we need clear evidence-based, science-based approaches to determine green building, approaches to green building that actually work, and that will give certainty to banks to, that there are clear propositions that they can finance, and we can start to have more serious discussions about the terms, what a bank can expect from a green home if they have some sense of certainty about the outcome in terms of running costs, in terms of the impact on occupants, and all sorts of things like that. But the point I was trying to make was that green homes, if we take the right kinds of approaches, can produce a bunch of different benefits that are very unusual in the discourse on environmental action. So it's not about sacrifice. It's about giving people homes that are, first of all, because we spend, depending on the country, anything in and around 80 to 90% of our time in buildings, and the vast majority of that in our homes, right? Our families, our children, when they're, most in need of nurture and protection and a safe, stable, healthy environment. So creating homes that are comfortable in all weather, whether it's freezing cold or in hot weather, homes that are capable of retaining comfort and staying sort of safe to occupy in the event of things like power cuts. That's a really kind of important sort of benefit too. Homes that will have good indoor air quality, so that you don't have, there's a bunch of different potential threats you could face, whether it's to do with cooking or to do with appliances like a stove, for instance, in a home. Anything that when you burn something indoors in the space where you spend most of your time, even if it's a closed stove, there are risks with that, frankly, and there are particular kinds of pollutants that we need to be concerned with. Moisture, mold, all of these kinds of issues that you can run into in buildings when you're washing and drying clothes indoors or cooking indoors. We have ways to address all of these things and to produce homes that are comfortable, cheap to heat, not so dependent on imported gas and oil as well. So we can think about building resilience and sort of independence, the ability to kind of start to protect yourself against some of the geopolitical sort of tensions that obviously countries like Ukraine and and more broadly Europe as a consequence of that are facing. And you can produce just nicer places to live, basically. I mean, you can take it beyond outside the front door to the biodiversity around you. Creating kind of I mean, who wants to live in a place where you don't have birdsong outside, or where you don't have the prospect of, the idea of having, whether it's squirrels or the kind of animals that you get when you get a rich biodiverse kind of environment. And then on top of that, not having to drive, locating homes in the right kinds of locations so that you don't end up having to drive an hour or two a day just to get about your life, stuck in traffic. So yeah, it's
but you are now on, let's say, green homes, right?
I know,
we have now defined very well what is a green home. So just to clarify, when we're talking about the mortgage, is it the actual mortgage that makes this mortgage green, or is it the mortgage, which means financial product for a home that is green? Where is the saving coming? Is it a cheaper financial product, or is it more expensive square meters for you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So essentially, when we talk about a green mortgage, for the most part, in general, what we talk about is a mortgage to facilitate the construction or purchase of a green home, right? So a lot of the focus in finance in the past, sustainability-wise, has been around ethical finance, which is to do with where the money has been invested, and they're all important considerations too, whether it's munitions or drugs or avoiding some of these kinds of things. But so the first thing with the green mortgage is it's about hopefully having a financial institution that understands the business case and even the kind of collective sort of moral responsibility that we have to act on climate and on the broader environmental crises we have. And the fact that homes are an enormous chunk of the environmental impact that most of us will ever have, and banks have the ability to help move the market. So it may be the case sometimes when we talk about a green mortgage, what we're trying to encourage banks to do is, first of all, just recognize the importance of supporting green homes. And then linked to that is this idea of facilitating that by offering preferential lending terms. That might be an interest rate reduction, for instance. It might even be, in some cases, that you could consider the extra, the energy savings, for instance, that the homeowners will yield from a home as extra income. So that could increase their purchasing power, for instance. It could be regarded almost as extra salary because it's very stable as well. You know, we know obviously energy prices can go up and down a little bit, but you will be using your home, you will be needing to power and heat it. There's sort of certain certainties there. When you look at this over the period of a mortgage, there can be absolutely enormous savings. And at the end of it, because these considerations are only growing, you're protecting the value of the asset. So there's research already being published in different markets on some of the economic benefits of green mortgages and of green buildings more generally. There's a famous study, for instance, by the Institute for Market Transformation in the States, I think they're an offshoot of, I think, the University of North Carolina, and they took a study where they identified a large sample size. It was in the order of tens of thousands of homes that had been built to the US Environmental Protection Agency's Energy Star rating system. So this is just focused on energy, to be fair. And they compared that against a essentially demographically similar or otherwise similar group of non-energy efficient homes, of standard homes, and controlled for like the income of the purchasers. They controlled for the location, ethnicity, and so on. Like a bunch of different kind of considerations that, when you're doing a proper piece of scientific research, could, if you didn't look at them, affect the outcomes. And what they found was a 32% reduction in mortgage default risk in the Energy Star rated homes compared to the non-energy efficient homes. And the other thing that's fascinating about this is that the Energy Star system has like many of the EPC scales that we have in Europe, well, like the EPC scales in general that we have across Europe, it has it's a kind of hierarchy of scores. So, I can't remember how theirs is expressed, but for EPCs, we have, in Ireland, A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3, and so on, down through the order, down to a G rating. What they found was that the higher up the Energy Star score the buildings achieved, the lower the default risk was as well. So, there are compelling arguments there for financial institutions, and they're mind-numbingly obvious, I would say. If you give people a home that you can say with a very high degree of confidence is going to cost a lot less to run than another home, then it can only help, to reduce the risk to the bank.
Let's stop here for a second. A lot less to run, very important from the consumer point of view, and this is what I wanted to clarify. So it's clear for the bank, it can be, a little bit of a marketing gag. For example, greenwashing, hopefully not, but they're developing a product, they're calling it green. If they can do it more preferential, it's super. If not, then it's just a banking product, a banking mortgage for a good quality residential square meters, let's put it that way. But when we go to the actual users, residents, right, is it so that it is cheaper for them to run? And is it really paid back? Because I don't know, in countries like Ukraine, we tend to believe that whatever comes with the greenhouse or passive house or whatever other upscale house, it also means more expensive. So is there real value for the people also to invest at that already?
Well, yes and no. It can yield enormous savings for people, and it may not as well. It sort of depends, right? So a lot of the early attempts at sustainable building that have been built are very unusual buildings generally, right? They're architect designed a lot of the time. Most homes in Ireland, at least, are not architect designed, really. They're kind of cookie cutter homes, what we might call, like developer built homes, for instance. So, so that can increase cost. You end up with decisions being taken a lot of the times with some of the early eco homes that, like a lot of the products that you'll see early on supporting, say, the passive house standards. Some of the products, at least, if you take windows, would be a really high spec product, even if you cut out their energy performance credentials, right? You're talking about, high end Austrian or German windows, for instance, right? Timber alley clad windows, really, with a very high quality finish generally. So there are properties there, and they may support the long-term performance of the window. So they may in that way support the greenness of the product, but they're not inherent necessarily to the greenness of the product, and they may just be a premium product because they're kind of sold in that way. So there are issues like that. That said, there's lots of decisions that you can take in the construction of a green home that can reduce costs, and there are lots of things that are cost neutral. A lot of what we're talking about is common sense too. So, I mean, I'll give you an example. One of the ways that a green housing scheme can substantially reduce construction costs, and this may not be popular with everyone, is if you plan a community better, you have better cycling, walking, and public transport infrastructure. You may not need so many car parking spaces per home, right? Well, they can substantially increase the cost of a home. So that is, for instance, one little example. Another thing, a compact passive house is a good example for this. So passive house as a standard, while you can achieve it with any design of building, it's much simpler to achieve with a compact shape of a building. Okay, a compact shape of building, like a cube-shaped building, ideally, for instance, right? I mean, you have to be realistic about these things. There are lots of other considerations that people will have, but the more compact the shape of the building, the cheaper the construction costs are generally, right? So that there's examples like that. And then again, with something like passive house, what you're trying to do with passive house is design the building to be so well built, so energy efficient in the construction of the building, that the investment you need to put into installing a heating system is substantially reduced. So you can have smaller heating systems. Some people push it. I don't know if I agree with this. We have certainly published buildings in the magazine over the years where people have had literally no heating system. Okay, and measured the performance of the building. There was a sheltered housing scheme in England that we featured, an 18-unit apartment building in Exeter, that we published 7-8 years ago or something like this. And it was elderly people. Sheltered housing means social housing was essentially for or retirement housing for elderly people. Elderly people, as I'm sure you know, they tend to spend more time indoors, and they tend to have higher thermal comfort requirements for all sorts of physiological reasons. Consequently, they tend to have the highest thermal comfort demands of any kind of consumer. And in this case, it was a German passive house architect who was sort of stereotypically dogmatic in his approach. So he was like, no, they're passive houses. They do not need heating systems. I thought he was very brave to put, to go that far. So all he did was put a little battery, thermal battery, a booster heater on the ventilation system. And 5 years after that development was completed, there was a UK government, Innovate UK, funded monitoring study and a post-occupancy study where they interviewed the occupants. Thankfully, all of them were still alive, so that's a good sign. But in 9 of the 18 apartments, they hadn't turned the post heater on at all in the first 5 years. Cool. So, there's examples like that. I mean, I would always think it's good to. There's an old engineering maxim, which is that it's better to be looking at it than looking for it. And I think that applies here. In other words, to give people, you don't want to kind of spend too much on redundancies, but having the capacity to easily add a heating system, for instance. So there's things like that. And then the broader point is that, the economics of these things are changing. When you start off as a niche, of course it's going to be, there are costs. There are costs which can be for the designers and the tradespeople to learn how to build these things. We certainly see contractors who are brand new to this, sometimes pricing in a lot extra because of the risk, because they don't know what they're dealing with. So they might add 10 or 20% just because of their fear, right? But as they learn more about it, a lot of those costs evaporate, because a lot of what we're talking about is common sense. It's just good quality workmanship, and then you get economies of scale. You get manufacturers. So we are now seeing some big manufacturers of different kinds of products suitable for these buildings being manufactured, and these things transform the economics of it too.
Now, thank you. There's surely a lot to learn also for Ukrainian communities, and a lot of good examples that you brought in. Thanks, Jeff. And tell me, so green mortgage is one of these topics that Smarter Finance for EU project is promoting. Can you tell us a few more words about this program and what are its ideas and targets? And European Ukrainian Energy Agency is part of the consortium together with many organizations, numerous green building councils from different countries in European Union and not only. So what else there on the agenda of this program?
So the program, I suppose, why this app is doing that. It's turning off my camera when I get a phone call. Strangely, but I don't know how to mute them or to stop, make myself unavailable.
Just continue.
Okay.
The program.
So, Smarter Finance for EU, I think of its full name, is part of the sort of broader Smarter initiative. There was a preceding project which we were not a partner in. We had a subcontracting role in towards the end of, called Smarter Finance for Families. What these projects are, and we focus on Smarter Finance for EU specifically now, it's a project that is aiming to unlock across Europe 100 billion euro worth of certified green homes. And when we say certified green homes, we mean homes that are not greenwashing, are not just slapping some green lipstick on a pig. We're talking about robust, credible certification systems that are aligned with the EU's requirements. So the EU has a taxonomy for sustainable economic activities, which defines whether an investment can be considered green or not, and therefore considered as part of the EU Green Deal. In order to do that, we are working with some partners who already have existing green home certification systems, and some partners who are trying to develop new green home certification systems. So we have partners in the Romania Green Building Council, the Irish Green Building Council. We have partners in Ukraine, as you mentioned. We have Habitat for Humanity. We've got the Spanish Green Building Council, Green Building Council of España, and ADEN, the Portuguese Energy Agency, along with a Luxembourg-based sort of green finance consultancy called Enersafe, and ourselves, Positive Plus. There's a few facets to it. Part of it, as I say, is either developing green home certification systems. That will be happening in Ukraine and in Portugal. Refining the existing established green home certification systems that are already set up in Romania, Ireland, and Spain. And encouraging other partners to join in other countries too. So that's certainly part of our thinking. The green home certification is part of it. Part of it too then is reaching out to different kinds of new partners. So that can include financial institutions, financial institutions, whether it's banks or investors, funds or whatever. It can include property developers. They're absolutely essential for this too, and there's some amazing stuff starting to happen in that regard. And municipalities too. So we have social landlords, for instance, who need assistance in this regard to kind of try and reduce their carbon footprints, to protect vulnerable people who may be at risk of energy poverty, who are, their tenants, for instance. And there are solutions here that we can achieve in all those regards. And then there's broader considerations too. We're also trying to reach what the project defines as solution providers, and that just basically means sort of everyone with a professional interest in the delivery of green homes, designers, tradespeople, product suppliers, and specialist consultants, and so on, because we need collaboration. We need to all kind of try and corral around coherent, credible, verifiable approaches, to delivering real green homes that actually work for real people.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So we now talked a little bit about green homes. You mentioned passive houses. I wanted to jump a little bit to one more thing that is coming closer to Ukraine right now. We have been working as a country with the international donor support on the NZEB standards, and we are very much as market players expecting the standards to go into force any minute now. While observing the first project and already even implementation and active preparation. So in 1.5 years, we will have, if I'm not wrong, at least 4 schools modernized based on the NZEB requirements, unless something else comes up faster. So net zero energy buildings, right? Where Ukraine is at a very early stage over here. How is it from your experience, both international and in Ireland? Is it already like a basic standard, or are you also still struggling on the way? Any lessons learned for us in there?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So the nearly zero energy building standard, which came in under the recast energy performance of building. Sorry, it's worth clarifying this as well. It's very confusing. There are 2 different. There were prior to the recast directive that came, Energy Performance of Buildings Directive that came into effect in 2019. There were 2 different sort of acronyms for NZEB. One was Net Zero Energy Building, which is what a lot of people think this means, and the other is Nearly Zero Energy Building, and this is what the EU target is. If you want to re-ask the question again, by the way, that's completely fine. If you'd rather do that, because you mentioned.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
You can answer the correct question.
Okay. Well, they're both correct. There's no wrong question. They're both correct questions. Wait. So yeah, the directive was recast in 2010, and it set a requirement for nearly zero energy buildings, and it's a funny thing actually. That target, it can sound a bit like, if I don't know if this expression is the same in Ukraine, it can sound a bit like half pregnant,
Yes.
a building is a building.
We have that expression.
Yeah, is it zero energy or not, right? But actually, now it may be that target was set on the basis of kind of bureaucratic negotiation, but in some ways, it's actually quite a useful target because one of the risks that we run into with green building and with attempts to decarbonize more generally is kind of accountancy trickery, and creating, carbon neutrality is a great example of that. You may have seen some of the reporting that's come out in the last couple of years suggesting that lots of the carbon offsetting schemes, I think more often the rule rather than the exception with carbon offsetting schemes is that they tend not to actually offset carbon in anywhere near the extent expected. So you buy a product that's got a carbon neutral label on it, it's not carbon neutral, and it's a fantasy which allows people to think that they don't have to make the kinds of changes to our lifestyles that we probably unfortunately do have to make, which is. These are very problematic, knotty questions in a kind of capitalist system that we have, and I guess we will always have. But nearly zero energy as a target, it sort of actually reflects the truth of the matter, which is that, you could have a zero energy building, but it would be a building with no light, no heat, no power, no ability to charge anything, right? So the question then is, should you instead aim to have a net zero energy building? Well, you can, but this again is complicated, because you see, just because you're generating energy through a wind turbine, for instance, or through a solar array that's on your roof, it doesn't mean that you're generating it when you need it, which means you either then have to store the energy and you'll have some storage losses, right? Or you'll have to transfer it back to the grid and you'll have transmission losses and probably some storage losses too, and you hope that there'll be a demand for it. So it's kind of complicated, right? Net zero, it's still worth aiming for net zero as a target, but it's really important within that that efforts should first of all focus on reducing demand within the building. So we've had a nearly zero energy building definition in Ireland, which has been enforced since 2019, and it's pretty good. It's improved things. We have decent insulation standards, decent air tightness standards. We have a mandatory renewable energy requirement for all new homes as well. Okay.
For new homes or for reconstruction also? So what is your, if you were talking residential stock, how close you are to this overall wonderful goal?
Well, so for all of our new homes are legally required to meet this target, right? And that's the requirement.
Nearly zero energy buildings.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's the requirement in the directive across Europe, right? Then there is a requirement for existing buildings that when they undergo major renovation, they must be upgraded to what they call cost optimal levels of energy performance to align with the Commission's ultimate targets of a net zero. Well, ultimately they've revised this with the latest revision of the directive, but it's ultimately they're aiming for a net zero carbon European building stock by 2050. Now, and that, bear in mind, the goalposts are shifting on this all the time, because the buildings, it doesn't make sense to consider each building as an independent, like as an island, right? It's much more sensible to think of these things as part of a system. We have an electricity grid, for instance. That doesn't mean that you can't reduce your reliance on it and give yourself resilience in the event of power shortages or whatever. But it's not economical or environmentally sustainable to try and create this concept of an individual house, for instance, that is completely independent from the rest of the world, right? Especially if you want to have the kind of standard of living that people want in terms of, the warmth, the ability to have, all the power you might want at your disposal and so on, and let alone to charge an electric car off it and all these kinds of things, So you can, when you get to net zero, I mean, it's funny. With our national system in Ireland, you could take an existing home, right? And you could achieve a net zero rating. Just to, I'm not confusing matters here, but you could achieve a net zero score on a building with no insulation, with basically no windows even, simply by connecting a big enough solar array or big enough
renewables.
Yeah, exactly. So in other words, net zero, depending on how it's defined, but like in absolute terms, it's really just about making sure that everything you generate, everything you use in the building is matched by generation, right? So in other words, you could catch your death of hypothermia in a net zero energy building, right? So it's not necessarily that useful a target unless you come up with a specific definition, and this doesn't really exist yet, certainly not in Europe, of a net zero energy building that has very tight standards defined in terms of comfort and so on. Now, the EU has recently last year passed a new target for what they call a zero emissions building, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
just to make our lives even more difficult, yeah.
I know, And that again is aiming for 2050. And that, by the way, is intended not just to count energy use within the building. It's meant to count whole life carbon. So in other words, that means the embodied carbon that you release when you manufacture materials to construct a building and then maintain the building and then dispose of them over time. So there, again, there's no, like, and again, people get confused thinking about using biogenic, materials like crops that rather than mining for materials, crops that are regenerative, whether it's wood or straw or whatever it might be. They're fantastic materials to use, and they have a really important place to play. So I don't want to denigrate them for a second, because they are really, really important in this overall context. But the idea, when you talk to experts involved in whole life carbon calculation, like life cycle assessments, they'll tell you they're not really carbon neutral materials either. Because ultimately the carbon, whether it's 100 years or 200 years time, ultimately the carbon in those materials will get, because plants absorb CO2, they absorb carbon dioxide when they're growing. And if you build with that material, you store some of that CO2 in the building for the duration of the time that material is in there. But ultimately, it gets released back into the atmosphere. It may take hundreds of years, it may take thousands of years. There are timber frame buildings, Japanese buildings, that are thousands of years old. But it's also important to say, with all of these things, with zero emission buildings and with NZEB, the one that we currently have, nearly zero energy buildings, it's not really accurate, I would say, to call it a standard. It's a target that the EU has, and each member state has to come up with its own national definition, right? So it's very confusing, and that's intended to kind of create, I guess, to give member states the flexibility to take account of their climate, their construction tradition, their an architectural tradition, and so on, and the political considerations that come into play.
This is what I want to ask. Is this can we say that it's one of these, let's say, support mechanisms to support the EU taxonomy directive in all these life cycle costs and this circular economy type of things, right?
Yeah. They're all linked. I mean, they're all part of this broader piece. What I'd say is, one of the reasons why a project like Smarter is so important is because there's been a surge of interest now in response to some of these regulatory drivers, for instance, right? An energy crisis doesn't, obviously doesn't hurt too in terms of making people take an interest. But when you have a surge of interest like this, there's scope for lots of confusion and lots of well-meaning attempts that don't work out. And we have a construction industry that has a long history right across the world of building buildings and then running away, like not paying much attention to the actual outcomes, so we end up with a bunch of problems. We can end up with, if you take approaches and you haven't assessed whether they're really rigorous and whether they work, you can end up with the so-called performance gap. You can end up using a lot more energy than predicted. You can end up with overheating problems. You can end up with, again, being too cold in the winter, or moisture problems, or there's a poor indoor air quality. There's a bunch of kind of issues that you can run into. So one of the reasons projects like Smarter are so important is that fundamentally they're being led by organizations with pretty deep-rooted expertise in green building. That is, the value of that is incalculable, in terms of helping the industry in countries around Europe to coalesce around solutions that can be relied upon to actually work.
Okay. Now that we are at, we arrived on the EU taxonomy topic. How is your market now? I don't want to say reacting. Is it already, has it already adjusted to this new reality of EU taxonomy and these numerous requirements? Because, for Ukraine, it's also a big topic at the moment. For us, many of these aspects are becoming part of the negotiations in process of the EU accession. But the industry, I have a feeling, is by far not ready, except for certain international companies that are still operational here. How was it for you? What were these challenges, and how is the market coping?
It's different parts of the market are moving at different rates, right? So the point that so I also have a consultancy called Zero Ambitions Partners, and my colleague in that comes from the finance sector, from the financial services sector. And one of the points he always makes is that buildings are downstream of finance, right? If once finance moves on these things, everything changes, and that is starting to happen. And I think it's happening because there's some, given the political change in Europe with the recent European elections and so on, there's some pushback happening against some of these new regulatory drivers. The corporate sustainability reporting directive, for instance, was an omnibus published this week in that regard. But my sense is that both from talking to some of the bigger developers in Ireland and some of the financial institutions, is that the money's moved and that it's not going to move back. That there's a kind of a recognition now and long-term kind of planning being put in place to of the need to act. So how that doesn't affect the market evenly, though. It means, for instance, that the biggest developers, and this is something I never foresaw happening, people who I would normally be very cynical about, they're the ones who are having to move first on this, because they are, they're like PLC companies, public limited companies, and they have shareholders to answer to. We've had a large spate of a shift in Ireland in the last 5 to 10 years of institutional investors getting involved in developing or acquiring, apartment buildings, so kind of buildings that we weren't really building historically, and they have new demands being placed on them by their investors. So that's driving. So, for instance, when we had the banking sector launch of Smarter Finance for EU in Brussels in May, we brought along the head of sustainable construction and reporting in Cairn Homes. So Cairn are one of Ireland's 2 largest developers. Depending on the year, they're either the biggest or the second biggest, right? They build about 2,000 homes a year, typically in Ireland, right? We're a country that builds, historically about 25,000 homes a year. We're over 30 at the moment. There's a bit of a boom on. They we had a hand in encouraging to do this, which is exciting. They've committed to building. At present, they're on site with 1,800 units, which are going to be certified passive houses. They're going to be meeting net biodiversity gain. They are going to be Home Performance Index certified, which is the Irish Green Buildings Council's taxonomy-aligned green home rating system. And they're thinking about sustainable transport. Again, cycling, walking, public transport links, all these kinds of things. And they're doing this specifically for social housing. So they're going to be addressing the energy poverty issue. And you know what? They have decided not to pass on any increase in construction cost to their customers. So the social landlords who are buying these are paying what they would pay for any Cairn development. And Cairn are not giving them a choice. They are building them because it makes sense. And Cairn, when you talk to them about about why they've gone this route, it's in large part it's been a response to these new regulatory drivers that they've been facing. So they have obligations as a big company. They're one of the first wave of companies that's subject to these reporting obligations, and it's mad. They have to report the emissions, all emissions downstream and upstream of the buildings that they produce. What that means is the upstream emissions are all of the emissions released in the construction of the building. So that's the embodied carbon. The downstream is all the emissions done by the users of the buildings over 60 years, right? They sell.
Not really.
They have to look at 60 years worth.
Are they staying as the how you call it, building
No.
maintenance services? They're getting out of the development.
They're getting out, but they still have to. They're handing them over, and we're working through our consultants. Actually, working with them to kind of try and assist them in ensuring they're really keen that it's as smooth as possible a handover process. So they have a good reputation in that regard in Ireland for.
Can we invite them for Ukraine for a little bit of social housing development? Pass on our contacts, please.
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy to talk to developers there. But they're an amazing company. But what's fascinating too is that while the route into this may have been their obligations, right, in terms of reporting, and something has happened. It's like a light bulb has gone off within the company, and there's a sense of excitement and enthusiasm about this. So Stephen O'Shea, their head of sustainable construction, was talking recently to me about meeting their CEO, their chief executive officer, and Michael Stanley, and reporting to him on the figures that he was getting for, you know, projected carbon emissions reductions through these schemes, right? Mm. And his CEO turned around to him and said, Stephen, you're missing a point. You're missing the point. We're giving our customers and the people living in these homes warm, healthy homes that are going to cost very little to heat. So in other words, there's an excitement at the top level within that company, which is permeating down through the company, that they can, because I don't think companies necessarily, you know, most companies don't set out to do bad things, you know. It's just that circumstances mitigate against quality a lot of the time. But
this is
they don't have
different level of awareness or self-consciousness, so to say. But I have to ask here, because before that you mentioned that they went into this development, and you said that they have decided not to pass on this, let's say, extra cost, so to say, for all this higher standard of the building, but they still have to. It's still business, right? So where is the money coming from then?
Well, so part of it is that I don't want to betray any confidences, and obviously they keep their cards a little bit close to the chest on some of this, but clearly I think there's a recognition within Cairn that the extra costs for building these homes in Ireland are really not that much of a deal. Okay. They're not much of an issue, especially because we're comparing against our, you know, building to the nearly zero energy building standard, which we have to do anyway. And because, as I said, literally, it is the case that some of the decisions that they're taking are going to be cutting costs down. So they are putting in smaller heating systems into these homes. They still put heating into these apartments. They are putting some. So some of the extra investment in the quality of workmanship, and they'd have good quality processes in place anyway, are offset against reduced cost in terms of purchasing, you know, a lot more radiators or larger heating systems than they might need, right? So there's those kinds of things, but there's also recognition within there that some of the costs that they've had to put into the first projects, they won't face with subsequent projects. So, for instance, a lot of the costs now would be investment in people. Which is training their designers, tradespeople, you know, to about how to deliver Passive House. And once those investments are done, as one of the kind of the top Passive House experts in Europe, Tomas O'Leary, says, once you see these things, you can't unsee them. You know, it changes how you deliver things. It's like airtightness is a fundamental part of Passive House, right? And people, it's very important to explain that when you talk about this, you still, this is not to say that you don't have ventilation. It's quite the contrary. You should have a much more reliable ventilation strategy than in nearly any building in the likes of Passive House, because you have a properly designed and installed and commissioned ventilation system, which is set up to deliver a predictable level of air changes. That's in what I call the kind of Goldilocks zone. You know, not too much, not too little. The problem with ventilation, if you give people too much, they feel discomfort, and it might be better from an air quality perspective, but people will sabotage the ventilation system because there's too much heat going out the window, or the fan is too noisy, or they're uncomfortable. You know, so you have to. So in Karen's case, Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to see where they ultimately go with it. But we know, and we have published case studies in Ireland in the past in our magazine of ridiculously cheap, passive house schemes built by. There's a scheme in County Wexford built nearly 10 years ago, a small enough scheme, and the developer built them for he proved, and there was an academic study which was costed by a quantity surveyor, that the cost uplift of building passive house for this scheme compared to building to the regulations was, I think, 130 euros per home. So that's not to say there are examples
sorry,
that are much more.
130. Sorry, what is 130 euros per home?
The extra construction costs.
Per home,
the extra
or per square meter?
Per home.
Okay.
It sounds ridiculous.
We have to look. I will run out of time if I want to look into all these figures, but this is all fascinating.
I'll point them
out. Do point them out, please, into Ukraine's direction. We have, with the unfortunate circumstances where we are now, and the incredible amount of internally displaced people, the social housing, municipal housing is now high on the agenda. EU is financing already programs. A number of European, international, financial, and donor organizations are supporting these programs, and we're also trying to introduce higher standards in there with success rate, but yes, surely we're also very actively inviting all the international companies, and specifically also construction companies, experienced construction companies that can come and work on the market, and of course it's huge. So please do point them out in this direction. But as we are soon running out of time, a few perhaps closing questions. When we are talking about money, now you have destroyed almost my understanding of all this money issues, because there is no money issue, if I hear you right?
It depends. I mean, if you can do it expensively, of course you can, but you can build any building expensively, and some of these arguments depend as well on how high your standards are that you're comparing against,
Okay.
So yeah, but it doesn't need to cost much extra at all. Yeah.
Okay, but then a chicken or an egg question, in Ukraine, and one of my topics and one of these big questions where I'm waking up and going to bed with, in terms of Ukraine's reconstruction specifically, is building back better, which we are encouraged to, and there is a lot of dialogue also on the international level that for us it's an exclusive and unique chance, let's put it that way, to use this opportunity and rebuild and build whatever we have to build new or reconstruct better, meaning greener.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the reality is so that we are lacking competent human resources. Naturally, many of them serve or fight. Those that we have are not always equipped to use latest technologies, latest materials, or they might not even be available here. Obviously, we still believe it's more expensive. And one of the arguments also that it takes longer because of all these challenges, right? It simply takes longer to design a proper, more sustainable or green or passive or NZEP house. It takes longer to implement due to availability both of equipment and human resources to implement these projects.
Yeah.
So imagine yourself in Ukraine for a few minutes with this chicken or an egg question, and give us a little bit of wisdom. Building back better or faster? What's your say?
Well, so with the right approach, those two goals don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can build at speed and build well. The fundamental thing that you should do from a logic perspective, and I think from a sustainability perspective too, is just you assess your circumstances, you assess what your needs are, and what resources you have at your disposal. Frankly, what end goals you're trying to achieve, that's fundamentally important. but you know, and then you try and either design approaches that are you know, geared towards the resources at your disposal to achieve the end goals you want, or it's a bit different, but in sort of peace times, I'm thinking of examples like Brussels. There's a really interesting little story there. About 10 years ago, after the municipality of Brussels trying some pilot projects with Passive House, where they deliver quite large projects successfully, they kind of bit the bullet and decided to just go for it and to make the Passive House standard, or a Brussels-based version of it that they developed in conjunction with the Passive House Institute, mandatory for all new buildings and also for major renovations in the whole canton of Brussels, right? And when they were putting this together, some of the architects involved in developing that standard, a guy called Sebastian Moreno, for instance, said that the industry was gnashing its teeth, complaining about what this is going to mean, that the local supply chain would not be capable of building these buildings. And I think they were conjuring up images of like prefabricated homes arriving from trucks in Bavaria, but you know what? They set the standards. They stuck to their guns. They stuck to their convictions. And once the standard came in, the industry just got on with it. And they found, this is the fascinating thing, they found their own ways of developing. Now, Ukraine is a different scenario in that you have a bunch of very specific challenges that you kind of need to try and work around. So you kind of need to be a bit more active. But in the case of Brussels, like, they found ways of enabling the supply chains to the industry found ways to make existing build methods that were common in the area to adjust them to build to the new standards. And there are some simple details which I won't bore you with now, but simple kind of approaches to construction details that proved really robust, really effective, and kind of de-skilled the process. You can find ways to de-skill it. Sometimes it's down to a product, sometimes it's down to know-how. I would say it is essential for Ukraine, if these goals are to be, to stand any chance of being adhered to, given your circumstances. I think it's essential that you have that you engage with some experts. I would say for Ukraine that if you want to really achieve these goals and to actually build back better and to do it at scale in your very challenging circumstances, that you engage with people with real expertise, like hands-on practical expertise. And there's a lot of consultants who might seem like they know what they're doing in this sort of space as well, but like, for instance, you want people who have expertise in delivering these buildings and in studying how the buildings actually perform, because that's the problem. You can set a notional target that works well on a spreadsheet but doesn't work in reality, and experts who can take account of the particular challenges that you're facing. So if you're going to have a difficulty finding a skilled workforce to deliver these buildings, you can design around that. You really can. But that's a piece of work that needs to be done. There's a whole piece of sort of detailed work in terms of the of planning for that, given your specific circumstances. But yeah, it's absolutely achievable.
Thank you, Jeff. I don't want to misuse the time, and time has this tendency to run out. I have a feeling I haven't outsourced my list of questions. I will give you a break, and then I might come back with you for another round, second session.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Yeah, I mean, if I haven't sent you or your listeners to sleep this time, then by all means come back another time. Yeah.
Sure. No, there is an incredible amount of competence and things that lessons learned for Ukraine, and I would be pleased to host you again. Thank you very much for being with us, ladies and gentlemen. Our guest today was Jeff Colley, editor and publisher of Passive House Plus Green Building magazine. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for everyone who was listening, and we'll be back with you shortly in future podcasts, EUEA Dialogues. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.